So, once we have your goals, health history, and your functional movement screen score, we're ready to start the programming process. Here's what that programming process is going to look like initially. With your health history and functional movement screen and goals complete, we now have an idea of what you want to get to, but where are you starting? With the scores back from your functional movement screen, if we see anything that's a 0, we need to refer to a clinician unless you've already been to a clinician for that particular movement problem, in which case we can continue to do the work that that clinician has set for you, or if it's not working, then we need to maybe just work around it or possibly find a second opinion. If there's a 1 in your functional movement screen, we know that that's an area where we need work. So, if it's a 1 on a stability screen, then you need to get more stable. If it's a 1 on a mobility screen, then we need to get more mobile. If it's a 1 on one of the functional screens, in that case, we might need to do a little bit more of an integration of corrective exercises. So something that's not necessarily just a mobility exercise or just a stability exercise, but something that's going to be a more global movement pattern. If you've got 2s all the way around, then we're good to go. We're going to go with one of our more general warm-ups rather than a specific corrective routine. Regardless of what your scores are on the functional movement screen, everybody's going to learn how to do some soft tissue work or Self Myofascial Release, SMR. We use 2 tools for that. We use a lacrosse ball, we use a foam roller. You can just use these tools for massage, but what really makes them effective is movement while you're on the trouble spot. So, for example, if I'm rolling my lats on the foam roller, and I just roll back and forth, yes, that's going to feel good. That's going to get the nervous system talking to the muscles. We're going to get some benefit out of that. However, if I stop on a trouble spot on my lat and I make the joint segment that I'm treating, in this case, the shoulder girdle and the shoulder joint, if I make that joint segment move while I'm on that trouble spot, then I'm really going to get what Self Myofascial Release is all about, and that's myofascial release. So we've got a muscle, we've got fascia on top of it, that needs to move. We also have these layers of muscle. So if we weren't meant to have muscles that moved us in different ways, stacked up on top of each other, we wouldn't. If these muscles were all supposed to do the same thing, they would be just one muscle. Look at a snake. It's basically just a big set of paraspinal muscles. Well, that's all it needs. It doesn't need a massive array of muscles. It's got one joint segment, basically, the spine. Okay, it's got a job. But it doesn't need a lot of variety in terms of muscles. Well, we have joint segments that move all kinds of different directions. We have deep muscles, we have superficial muscles, we have stabilizing muscles, we have prime movers. These are all meant to move independently of each other. If we just roll out on the foam roller or the lacrosse ball, we might get a little bit of play between these layers of muscle. But if I stop on a trouble spot and make those muscles move, that's when we're going to get them to resume that independent function. So, functional movement screen gives us a snapshot of what your corrective exercises need to be, whether they're prescribed by a clinician or created as part of your warm-up plan by me. However your functional movement screen turns out, you're going to end up doing some soft tissue work or Self Myofascial Release. And then you'll get into one of the warm-ups. And the warm-up that I really like to start people off with is developmental movement patterns. So I take care of tissue quality with Self Myofascial Release. I address specific mobility or stability training needs with a stability or mobility-based corrective exercise. I integrate stability and mobility with the developmental movement patterns. These are the movement patterns that we go through from infancy to toddlerhood, early childhood, where we explore a whole array of movements. And it's actually the developmental movement patterns on which I base the sequence that I take people through the functional movement screen. First, babies are wriggling around, so I look at shoulder mobility and the active straight leg raise first, our two mobility screens. Then we figure out how to roll over. So I look at rotary stability, the first of our stability screens. Then we start to press ourselves up. Once we've rolled over from our back to our front, we press ourselves up. So I look at the trunk stability push-up test. Then single leg articulation. So I look at the hurdle step. Then going from a lunge to a stand. So I look at the inline lunge. Somewhere along that same arc, the squat to stand is in there. So we look at the deep squat. So mobility, stability, and functional movement screens. Mobility screens, shoulder mobility, active straight leg raise. Stability screens, rotary stability, trunk stability push-up. And functional screens, hurdle step, inline lunge, and finally deep squat. And that's it on the functional movement screen. We may come back around and reutilize that functional movement screen if it looks like we need to reassess. Frequently, your training will show you what you're now capable of, and you'll come to the realization that you're making improvements not by looking at the functional movement screen again, but by what you're capable of doing outside of the gym. That's the real tell that you're making progress.